The orders say the supplies must keep moving, but the rails ahead no longer feel certain. I ease the locomotive forward because heavy freight leaves little room for mistakes. The officers want speed, yet I trust the weight beneath my wheels more than their urgency. Something unseen is waiting farther along the line. A wartime railway timetable rarely attracted attention beyond the station office. Trains were expected to arrive, depart, and disappear into long columns of handwritten records that survived long after the smoke had faded. Yet in the winter of 1944, one freight movement through occupied Europe left behind almost no official recognition. The cargo never reached the soldiers waiting for it, the locomotive returned without the supplies it had carried, and the man responsible for guiding it through hostile territory remained little more than a name in scattered railway files. His work reflected a side of the Second World War where victory and defeat could hinge on ordinary transport, quiet decisions, and the unseen risks accepted by those who kept military railways moving. By the beginning of 1944, rail transport had become one of the most contested elements of the war across Europe. Every major army depended upon steel tracks to carry ammunition, fuel, food, replacement equipment, engineering materials, and medical supplies. Motor vehicles offered flexibility, but they consumed valuable fuel and struggled across damaged roads, especially during winter. Railways remained the backbone of military logistics despite becoming increasingly vulnerable to sabotage and air attack. Following years of occupation, Germany controlled extensive railway networks stretching from France and the Low Countries through Germany itself and deep into occupied Poland. Freight trains operated continuously, often under blackout conditions, while repair crews restored bombed lines almost as quickly as Allied aircraft damaged them. Schedules changed daily. Bridges disappeared overnight. Locomotives were reassigned with little notice. Railway workers found themselves performing civilian jobs inside an increasingly militarized transport system. Among those railway employees was Johann Keller, a 46-year-old locomotive driver employed before the war by the German State Railway. He had spent more than 2 decades operating heavy freight locomotives across central Germany. His experience lay not in military strategy but in understanding gradients, steam pressure, braking distances, and the countless mechanical details that determined whether hundreds of tons of freight arrived safely. Before the war, Keller's routes had consisted largely of coal, timber, and manufactured goods. Wartime transformed nearly every assignment. Civilian cargo steadily disappeared beneath military priorities. Flat cars carried tanks instead of tractors. Covered wagons transported artillery shells rather than commercial merchandise. Hospital trains received priority over passenger services. Freight crews learned not to ask unnecessary questions about sealed cargo. By January 1944, Keller had become accustomed to operating trains at irregular hours under strict security regulations. Station masters no longer announced destinations openly. Documents remained sealed until departure. Guards accompanied many military shipments. Railway workers understood only the portions of each journey necessary for safe operation. On a freezing evening near Kassel, Keller reported to the locomotive depot expecting another routine freight assignment. Snow-covered sidings already crowded with waiting trains. Steam drifted through the darkness as maintenance crews inspected valves and connecting rods beneath dim blue blackout lamps. Instead of his usual coal shipment, Keller received orders to prepare a Class 44 heavy freight locomotive assigned to a military convoy heading east. The locomotive had recently completed repairs after suffering minor damage during an Allied air raid. Mechanics worked quickly through the afternoon replacing damaged piping and inspecting the braking system. The train assembled behind his engine consisted of more than 30 freight wagons loaded with fuel drums, boxed engineering equipment, bridge components, spare vehicle parts, field telephones, medical stores, and packaged food. Several wagons carried replacement track materials intended for military railway repair units operating closer to the Eastern Front. Although Keller could not see every item listed in the manifest, experienced railway crews developed a practical understanding of military cargo simply by observing wagon markings and loading methods. This train represented weeks of accumulated supplies gathered from factories and depots across western Germany. Its destination lay far beyond Keller's normal route. The freight would eventually pass through eastern Germany into occupied Poland before connecting with military logistics centers supporting Army Group Center. By early 1944, German forces on the Eastern Front faced mounting pressure following successive Soviet offensives. Every shipment mattered. Departure came shortly before midnight. Heavy snowfall reduced visibility almost immediately. Keller maintained careful speed, conserving steam while preventing wheel slip across icy rails. His firemen worked continuously feeding coal into the furnace as freezing winds swept through gaps around the cab windows. Military dispatchers repeatedly altered routing throughout the night. Intelligence reports warned of possible Allied reconnaissance aircraft photographing railway movements during daylight. Freight convoys increasingly traveled after dark despite the greater danger of mechanical failure. The railway itself showed growing signs of strain. Sections damaged by previous bombing campaigns remained under temporary repair. Speed restrictions appeared without warning. Telegraph communications occasionally failed after storms brought down lines already weakened by months of emergency maintenance. Station personnel struggled to manage increasing congestion. Trains carrying wounded soldiers competed with ammunition shipments. Refugee transports occupied sidings alongside military freight. Coal shortages reduced locomotive availability. Delays spread through the network like ripples. Keller accepted these interruptions as part of wartime railway work. 2 nights into the journey, however, dispatchers halted his convoy outside a small junction in occupied Poland. Engineers reported damage farther east where partisan sabotage had destroyed several hundred meters of track beneath a secondary bridge. Repair crews estimated 24 hours before traffic could resume. Military officers guarding the train grew increasingly impatient. Frontline supply requests continued arriving through field headquarters. Every delayed wagon represented equipment unavailable where fighting remained active. The repair itself proceeded more slowly than expected. Explosive charges had twisted rails, shattered sleepers, and damaged signaling cables. Engineers also discovered structural cracks beneath bridge supports requiring additional reinforcement before heavy freight could cross safely. Meanwhile, winter temperatures continued falling. Steam locomotives required constant attention even while stationary. Fires had to remain lit to prevent boiler damage. Water supplies froze inside exposed pipes. Maintenance workers inspected wheel bearings repeatedly since prolonged stops increased mechanical risks. Keller spent much of each day checking lubricators, clearing ice from brake linkages, and assisting depot mechanics working under field conditions. The delay stretched into its 3rd day. During that time, Allied aircraft intensified attacks against railway infrastructure elsewhere across occupied Europe. Military headquarters responded by diverting numerous freight trains toward alternative routes. Eventually, Keller received revised orders. Instead of continuing along the original corridor, his train would proceed north before turning east through another railway line believed less vulnerable to sabotage. The alternative route had disadvantages. It contained steeper gradients, older bridges, and single-track sections where opposing traffic required careful coordination. Civilian railway workers familiar with the line warned that winter maintenance had become increasingly difficult because engineering materials remained scarce. Still, headquarters considered movement preferable to indefinite delay. The convoy departed before dawn. Snow gave way to freezing rain, coating rails with dangerous ice. Keller reduced speed well below official limits despite pressure from military escorts demanding faster progress. His caution frustrated several officers aboard the guard coach. Yet freight locomotives hauling thousands of tons possessed little margin for error on slippery grades. Excessive speed risked derailment. Excessive braking risked wheel damage. Hours later, the convoy approached a river crossing where temporary repairs had replaced sections damaged during earlier partisan activity. Track inspectors signaled permission to proceed. Keller remained uneasy. The locomotive responded differently beneath heavy load. Slight vibrations passed through the frame as wheels crossed recently replaced rails. Nothing indicated immediate danger, yet decades of railway experience taught him that unusual movement deserved attention. He gradually reduced speed again. Military officers protested. The bridge, they insisted, had already passed inspection. Keller nevertheless continued at cautious pace. Midway across, the locomotive reached stable ground beyond the bridge. Several wagons followed safely. Then a violent metallic sound echoed behind the engine. Emergency brake pressure dropped almost instantly. Keller shut off steam and applied every remaining braking measure available. The train ground painfully to a halt. Inspection revealed a fractured coupling between heavily loaded wagons carrying engineering equipment and bridge components. Several freight cars had rolled backward onto the bridge structure before coming to rest. No derailment had occurred. Yet the strain placed upon temporary repairs proved greater than expected. Within minutes, additional bridge supports shifted beneath the halted weight. Engineers ordered immediate evacuation. Railway workers uncoupled surviving wagons nearest the locomotive while crews attempted to secure those remaining across the bridge. Before the operation finished, weakened structural members collapsed beneath several freight cars. Wagons carrying bridge sections, fuel drums, and construction materials plunged into the icy river below. Others twisted off damaged rails, blocking both approaches. The locomotive itself escaped because Keller had reduced speed and halted before the failure spread beneath the engine. The cargo did not. Recovery efforts continued for days. Divers attempted to inspect submerged wagons where currents allowed. Cranes recovered scattered equipment from riverbanks. Fuel drums leaked into freezing water. Heavy bridge components settled beyond practical retrieval. Military investigators soon arrived. Their task centered upon determining responsibility. Bridge engineers presented maintenance records documenting emergency repairs. Track inspectors confirmed speed restrictions had been observed. Guard officers acknowledged Keller had actually traveled below the authorized limit despite repeated requests to accelerate. Mechanical examination found the failed coupling displayed hidden metal fatigue likely worsened by extreme winter temperatures and repeated wartime overloading. The official report assigned primary responsibility to material failure compounded by damaged infrastructure. Yet such conclusions offered little comfort. The shipment represented substantial engineering supplies urgently requested farther east. Replacement deliveries required weeks to assemble. Railway capacity remained limited. Factories already struggled against bombing, vehicle workshops reported shortages and raw of replacement parts expected aboard units the awaiting bridge convoy. Construction equipment. Medical depots redistributed remaining stores from neighboring sectors to compensate for missing cargo. No single battle depended exclusively upon Keller's train. Instead, its absence added another burden to an already strained logistical system where countless small interruptions accumulated into larger operational difficulties. For Keller personally, the consequences remained equally significant. Although cleared of negligence, he underwent repeated questioning by railway administrators and military transport officials. Experienced locomotive drivers occupied difficult positions throughout the war. They bore responsibility for valuable cargo while exercising limited authority over infrastructure, scheduling, and maintenance priorities controlled by distant headquarters. Keller returned to duty after several weeks. There was little alternative. Germany's railway network suffered severe shortages of qualified steam locomotive drivers. Every experienced crew remained essential despite mounting dangers. His subsequent assignments continued under worsening conditions. Allied bombing intensified through 1944, striking marshalling yards, repair workshops, bridges, and locomotive depots with increasing frequency. Railway employees often completed journeys through landscapes transformed overnight by air attacks. Maintenance standards inevitably declined. Replacement parts disappeared. Temporary repairs became permanent. Locomotives exceeded intended service intervals. Fatigue affected everyone from signal operators to mechanics. As the Eastern Front retreated westward, freight priorities shifted constantly. Retreating formations competed with reinforcement trains moving in the opposite direction. Refugees crowded stations already overwhelmed by military traffic. Keller's work became less about maintaining schedules than keeping damaged railways functioning at all. When the war ended in Europe during May 1945, railway records across much of Germany lay incomplete or destroyed. Entire archives disappeared beneath bombing. Rolling stock inventories no longer matched surviving equipment. Thousands of transport workers resumed civilian duties amid shattered infrastructure requiring years of reconstruction. Keller remained with the post-war Railway Administration. Steam locomotives still required experienced operators regardless of political change. Food, coal, construction materials, and displaced civilians all depended upon restored rail transport. He rarely discussed wartime freight movements. Like many railway employees, he viewed himself neither as strategist nor politician but as a transport worker whose responsibility centered upon moving trains safely whenever circumstances allowed. Official histories of the Second World War naturally emphasized campaigns, generals, armored offensives, and diplomatic conferences. Railway logistics appeared mostly in statistical summaries listing tonnage moved, bridges destroyed, or locomotives lost. Individual freight crews seldom entered those accounts. Yet historians studying wartime transport gradually recognized that military railways depended upon thousands of ordinary specialists whose names rarely appeared beyond payroll sheets and operating rosters. Drivers monitored aging locomotives through blackout conditions. Firemen maintained steam pressure during freezing nights. Signal operators directed increasingly chaotic traffic. Track inspectors walked vulnerable lines exposed to sabotage and bombardment. Maintenance crews rebuilt damaged rails under constant pressure to reopen routes before the next convoy arrived. The loss of Keller's freight train illustrated how vulnerable even routine supply operations had become by 1944. A shipment carefully assembled across factories and depots could disappear because of damaged infrastructure, exhausted materials, severe weather, and a single mechanical failure hidden inside a worn coupling. No dramatic battlefield surrounded the event. No celebrated commander witnessed it. Nevertheless, the consequences spread outward through repair units, supply depots, and frontline formations waiting for equipment that never arrived. Years later, scattered railway documents preserved only fragments of the incident. Inspection reports, freight manifests, maintenance records, bridge repair logs, and administrative correspondence concerning the destroyed convoy. Together they revealed the quiet